One of the most important parts of working with clay is understanding safety precautions. Clay is generally a safe material to work with as long as you work wet and clean up using wet materials. Clay dust can be dangerous for your lungs because it breaks down into silica particles, which, when inhaled, can kind of irritate the lining of your lungs. So, when working with clay, it's very important that you always work wet and clean wet. We're going to talk about the different stages of clay so you can understand some strategies for that and some cleanup methods. Clay exists in multiple different stages depending on the amount of water that is present in that piece of clay. Clay with lots of water is what we call slip. That's kind of like the yogurty stuff that you can work with, sometimes called potter's glue. The clay that you got in your plastic bag is actually called plastic clay, which the word plastic means it can be formed in anything and take its shape. If you think about how you can have plastic bottles and other plastic things, but they're made out of the same material. So plastic clay is what you get from the clay factory or from the ground. This is the on-formed clay. After we work with it, it's called formed wet clay. So it can have just as much water as plastic clay, but it's been manipulated. It's formed into a pot, into a sculpture. After clay sits out for a while though, it'll lose some of its moisture and become what's called leather hard. Leather hard clay is a little bit more solid, a little bit more rigid. This is the perfect stage for attaching pieces of clay. So if you're adding something to your sculpture, this is also the stage that's best for carving. But if we let too much water disappear, it's going to become what's called bone dry, and this is that chalky clay. This is where we run into the risk of getting clay dust particles into the air, which isn't good for our lungs. So we're going to talk about strategies to stay away from bone dry clay, how to identify bone dry clay, and what to do if your clay has become bone dry. Once your project is completed, you're going to bring it back to school, and we are going to set it on a cart and we're going to let it become bone dry. So we're going to let it dry out because any water in clay, whenever it's fired, will expand rapidly and cause your project to blow up or break apart. Think of this like a bubble on a piece of pizza. That water and moisture in the dough expanded whenever the pizza was heated up, and that's what created that air bubble. Unfortunately, with clay, something that'll turn to rock when heated to extreme temperatures, the clay won't expand, it'll just blow apart. So before firing any projects in the kiln, what we call the bisque fire, if you want to remember this, is like cooking biscuits, going from dough to that hard state, we need to let it dry out and turn bone dry. So it's very important to understand that slip is using a lot of water. That's what we can use to glue pieces together using water and clay. Plastic clay is on-formed, what you get straight from the bag. Formed wet clay is when it starts to take shape, and as water starts to evaporate from that, it becomes leather hard so that it can be rigid and a little more solid to attach. And when it becomes too dry, we call it bone dry because it's light and chalky. So there are multiple stages of clay, and we're just going to kind of review those real quick, talk about what the benefits of each stage are, and how to kind of protect yourself when working with them. So the first stage is slip. Typically, if you were in the studio, we would have containers with slip in it, which is basically just clay that's dissolved in water. But you will be making slip by adding water to the clay. So I've dumped my finger into some water, and if you just go over it, slip is that kind of gluey, watered down clay that happens whenever you add water to clay. So anytime you wanted to attach a piece of clay, you would score it or scratch it with a toothpick. You'd add some water and then scratch it again and then attach another piece that you had scratched, kind of like Velcro. So slip is watered down clay. Clay that is coming straight from the bag is called plastic clay. This is the clay that's the most malleable. It is stuff that can be moved and shaped. It's a little bit soft and it's easy to work with. It takes kind of the form of whatever's manipulated to it. So it's not super rigid and it can hold texture. It's kind of holding the texture of my fingers here. So if I mold that, I can go around, I can still smooth out cracks because it's in the plastic or formable phase. So this has a middle level of water in it. It's not so wet that it's slip, but adding a little bit of water to it can create slip. and it's not so dry that it's falling apart. So this is the perfect stage for starting a sculpture. So I made a little pot there out of plastic clay. It's very important that if you want your clay to stay wet, that you seal up your bag, that you check to make sure that you tuck under so that no moisture can get in there. And sometimes it's not a bad idea to also spray it down or add a fingerful of water as you work. If you let water sit on it too long though, if I put water inside this and filled it up, eventually it's going to break down and it's going to turn to slip. So you want to avoid having too much water left on it. You just need a light spritz, almost like the grass in the summertime with morning dew. So we've got slip by adding water. We've got formed clay that can turn back into slip by adding more water to it. And then we have leather hard. And I want you to notice that even though I'm pushing on leather hard, it's pretty rigid. It's a smoother form, so touching it's not going to leave fingerprints. But this is the best time to attach clay. So if I wanted to attach something to it, I would add some water to it. This would create that slip. I could come in and scratch it, add some more slip, and then I could attach other pieces to it and smooth them out. Now I just took plastic clay and I took leather hard clay and I attached them. And you really don't want to do that. And the reason why is because plastic clay has more water. It'll shrink at a different rate than leather hard clay, which has a lot less water. That'll create cracks that will make these two areas come apart a lot easier, especially in the kiln. So you really want all your attachments to be leather hard. If you're adding sculptural elements to your pinch pots, you want both areas to be about the same state of kind of dryness. So leather hard to leather hard. Another great thing about leather hard clay is that this is the best stage to go in and remove clay. You can carve into it using things like paper clips or toothpicks or other materials here. This is also the best clay to experiment with kind of creating multiple textures. So you're not forming it, but you're just modifying it, either by attaching or adding textures. The final stage, the stage we want to be aware of, is bone dry clay. And you'll notice quickly that the clay changes kind of color, kind of gets more chocolatey in the leather hard phase. It's very dark whenever it's wet in the plastic or slip phase. But whenever it is bone dry, it almost looks like chalk. And it's going to break off really easily. And it's very fragile, unlike leather hard clay, which can bend and get little cracks, but it won't just break apart like that. Bone dry clay is the most fragile. It's also the most dangerous stage to work with clay. We do not want to carve this. No carving with this. The reason why is that the dust will come off and it can also break a lot easier. The water in here makes it easier to carve in leather hard, but bone dry, it's just going to fall apart. Another thing people want to do is if their project accidentally dries out, they didn't cover it or wrap it well, they will want to go back in and spray it down. And you want to be very careful with that because bone dry clay will actually dissolve very quickly in water as opposed to something like plastic clay. That bone dry clay has not had any water in it, so it will dissolve rather quickly, and you can already see that it's starting to break down in there. If you ever wanted to make slip, you can let a little bit of clay dry out in a small container and add water to it, whereas it'll take much longer for the plastic clay. Now, if you do have a project that turns bone dry, one thing you can do is you can take a paper towel and you can either dip it in water and wring it out. I call this the mummification process. So I have a paper towel, it's pretty wet, and you can wrap it and kind of have it be like a sponge and it soaks up some more water. Or you can spray it down and wrap it. Now, the longer you leave it wrapped, the more likely it is to dissolve in that water. So you really want to make sure that you keep an eye on it. You do not ever want to attach bone dry clay to leather hard clay. Again, way too dry, way too wet, they will crack. So always attach light clay. Bone dry clay, really the best part of using bone dry clay is that it's the clay that we can stick into the kiln because there's no moisture in there to make it blow apart. Moisture will heat up and move and have those pieces move apart. So bone dry really is just the stage that we should be firing work. We really shouldn't be working with the work. But if you get in a jam, wet a paper towel, wrap it, and then you can remove it. And even just here in a moment, you can see that's darkened that color, and now I can go in and I'm not creating dust. So it doesn't take long. So be careful when working with bone dry clay. Try to keep your projects in the plastic or leather hard phase until you're done with them so they can dry out. All right, so you've been working with your clay. You've got some dry scraps here, maybe as we carve. Some pieces end up on the table. And normally whenever we have something, we might take our hands and kind of scoop them off to the side. Or use a dust brush and kind of clean them up, or maybe a vacuum cleaner, but we're really not going to want to do that with this. What you want to do is work wet and clean wet, which means that these supplies, these little pieces of bone dry clay, they contain silicone. If they get crushed, that's going to put a dust into the air, and we want to avoid that. Ideally, when we're working, we don't want to end up with any bone dry pieces, but if we do, we're going to talk about what to do with that. So if you have some scraps like this, you can keep a container and kind of put a little bit of water in it, and the clay will dissolve and make some slip that you can kind of see here. So you can definitely grab those pieces and you can put them in water and they'll make some of that potter's glue for you. You can also just pick it up with your hands and put it in a paper towel or just put it in a waste basket. So I will do that. I'll transfer it to a paper towel. What you don't want to do is kind of scoop it off to the side and let that dust billow up. So what I'll do is I'll keep around spray bottles, and you can spray the area down and then wipe it up with a paper towel and throw this away. Or you can wet and wring out the rag that you've been given in your kit, and you can come through and wipe this up. Now, if you have big chunks, it's going to be easier to pick them up by hand. And what do you do with your clay chunks? Well, you can put them in the trash, but clay is a natural material, so you can also put it outside. Or you can put it in a container, wet it down, and clay can be recycled and reclaimed as long as it hasn't been painted or glazed. So as long as it's raw clay, this clay can have water added to it. It can go back to slip. We can let it dry out. It can turn back into plastic clay, and it can go through that cycle. You can also just toss it outside and let the earth take it back because that's where it came from. What you don't want to do is wash a ton of this water. If I wanted to get rid of this water or the slip water, I don't want to dump it down the sink. Clay can clog up pipes. If you're going to dump it down any area with your plumbing, you probably want to dump it into a toilet and flush. But again, you can just dump it outside. If you need to, you can rinse it out a few times, dump it out. It's no different than rainwater and mud and dirt. Just try to keep it away from sidewalks and areas like that so you don't create a mess. So always work wet when cleaning with clay, either using a wet rag, paper towel, and spray bottle, or if you have it, a sponge. And you want to go back in and you want to wash it off. And then you might want to go back, run some water through this, wring it out, and then wipe again. These rags are always used for clay, so whenever you return them, they don't have to be cleaned or laundered. I can take care of that later. Just make sure it keeps your own home